The Cascade Mountains, 11,000 feet above sea level. Rain hammers the rocky peaks like machine gun fire as flash flood warnings scream across every emergency channel. What started as a weekend hiking trip for 12 college students has become a nightmare of biblical proportions. Jake Mountain Man Morrison crouches in his hidden shelter, watching the chaos through reinforced walls that haven't leaked a single drop in 30 years. The hikers below are panicking, their expensive gear already soaked through, hypothermia setting in fast. They have maybe 6 hours before the real flood hits. Through his periscope, a clever arrangement of mirrors and sealed tubes he'd fashioned from salvaged submarine parts, Jake observes the group huddled beneath a pathetic lean-to that's already collapsing under the weight of accumulated water. Their North Face jackets and Columbia boots, probably worth more than most people's monthly rent, are proving as useful as tissue paper against nature's fury. The lead hiker, a blonde girl who can't be more than 20, waves frantically at something in the distance. Her voice carries on the wind, high and desperate, the trail's completely washed out. We're trapped! Jake's weathered hands tighten around his binoculars. 37 years old, though the mountain has aged him beyond his years, he's seen plenty of city folk underestimate the wilderness. Usually, he lets Darwin handle the sorting. But something about this storm feels different, wrong. His shelter, carved into the mountainside and sealed with a combination of pine pitch, bear fat and clay, techniques the Yakima tribe had perfected centuries before Gore-Tex existed, remains bone dry despite the torrential assault. The walls, reinforced with interwoven branches and sealed with layers of natural waterproofing, could withstand anything nature threw at them. Almost anything. A low rumble echoes through the valley, different from thunder. Jake freezes, his SEAL training kicking in. He knows that sound. 30 feet below, the hikers are too panicked to notice, but Jake's enhanced hearing, sharpened by years of absolute silence, picks up the subtle vibration traveling through rock and earth. Something's moving down there. Something big. The memory hits him like a physical blow. Classified files, underground caverns mapped by geological surveys, creatures that weren't supposed to exist. The mission that went wrong, the reason he'd fled to these mountains and never looked back. Command had assured him the entire network was sealed, contained. They'd lied about everything else. Why not this? Another rumble, closer now. The water pooling at the valley's base begins to churn, forming small whirlpools that shouldn't be possible in a flood. Jake's blood turns to ice as he remembers the briefing footage. Amphibious predators evolved in underground river systems, dormant for decades until rising water levels triggered their emergence. The hikers notice the churning water now. One of the boys, wearing a university sweatshirt that's plastered to his shivering frame, points toward the disturbance. What the hell is that? Jake's mind races through calculations. The flood will peak in 6 hours, but whatever's stirring beneath won't wait that long. The group has maybe 2 hours before hypothermia claims the weaker members, and less than 1 hour before those things fully emerge. Their current shelter won't last 10 minutes against either threat. His hands move instinctively to the radio equipment he hasn't used in 5 years. Emergency services are overloaded, and even if they weren't, no rescue helicopter could navigate these winds. The access roads are already underwater. There's no cavalry coming. The blonde girl, probably the group leader based on how the others cluster around her, pulls out a satellite phone with shaking fingers. No signal. Even if there were, Jake knows help couldn't reach them in time. The mountain takes what it wants when it wants. But Jake's shelter could hold them all. The construction is ancient but sound, layer upon layer of waterproofing, each technique learned from indigenous masters who'd survived ice ages in these peaks. The entrance tunnel, designed to prevent both water infiltration and unwanted visitors, could be sealed from the inside. Food stores, fresh water, emergency medical supplies, everything needed to wait out the storm and whatever emerges from the depths. The decision crystallizes with military precision. 30 years of solitude, 30 years of carefully maintained invisibility, all about to end because a group of kids chose the wrong weekend for their adventure. Jake Morrison, former Navy SEAL, current hermit, reluctant hero, checks his gear with practiced efficiency. Rope, emergency beacon, first aid kit, and the sealed container holding the most precious cargo of all, handwritten notes documenting every waterproofing technique he's learned, preserved in oiled leather and wrapped in bear hide. The storm intensifies, and something serpentine breaks the surface of the churning water below. Time's up. Jake seals his shelter's secondary entrance, shoulders his pack, and steps into the storm. 12 lives hang in the balance, and somewhere in the rising waters, ancient predators are waking from their long sleep. The first scream cut through the rain like a blade. Marcus dropped the pine pitch he'd been collecting and spun toward the sound, his weathered hands instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at his belt. Through the grey curtain of precipitation, he could make out shapes moving frantically near the tree line, people stumbling and falling as they crashed through the underbrush. Another scream, closer now. Definitely human, definitely terrified. He counted 6 figures emerging from the forest, their bright outdoor gear a stark contrast to the muted browns and greens of his domain. Hikers, city folk who'd gotten caught in the storm, probably lost and panicked. Marcus's jaw tightened. The last thing he needed was a group of helpless tourists complicating his preparations. But as they drew nearer to his cabin, he could see the raw terror etched on their faces. This wasn't ordinary panic from being lost in bad weather. Their eyes held something deeper, the primal fear of prey that knew it was being hunted. The lead hiker, a woman in her 30s with short auburn hair plastered to her skull, spotted him first. "Help us!" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the hammering rain. "Please, there's something in the water." "Slow down," Marcus commanded, stepping forward. His pale blue eyes swept over the group, cataloguing injuries and assessing their condition. 2 men, 3 women, 1 teenager, cuts and scrapes, signs of a hard fall or desperate flight, all of them soaked to the bone and shivering. "We were crossing the river about 2 miles upstream," the woman continued, fighting to catch her breath. "The water was already high from the rain, but we thought we could make it. Then Jake," she pointed to a lanky man nursing a bloody gash on his forearm. "Something grabbed him, pulled him under." Jake nodded frantically. I felt teeth, rows of them, like a shark, but wrong somehow. Too big, too many. I managed to break free, but he held up his arm, revealing parallel tears in the fabric and flesh beneath. Marcus examined the wounds with practiced efficiency. 4 distinct puncture marks, too large and oddly spaced to be from any native fish. The edges were clean, almost surgical. Whatever had made them possessed considerable bite force and razor-sharp dentition. "There's more than one," whispered the teenager, a girl with dark hair and wide, haunted eyes. We saw them moving under the water. Shapes, big ones. The woman, who'd introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist from Portland, stepped closer to Marcus. "I know how this sounds, but I've never seen anything like them. The way they move, their size—" She shook her head. "It shouldn't be possible. Not in fresh water, not at this altitude." Marcus felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. He'd heard the old stories, dismissed them as frontier mythology designed to keep settlers away from certain areas. His grandmother had whispered tales of things that lived in the deepest parts of the mountain lakes, ancient predators that surfaced only during the heaviest floods. He'd always assumed they were metaphors, warnings about flash floods and treacherous currents. Looking at Jake's wounds, he wasn't so sure anymore. The rain intensified, drumming against the cabin's metal roof like machine gun fire. Through the trees, Marcus could see the creek that ran past his property beginning to swell, its normally placid waters turning brown with runoff. In another hour, maybe less, it would overflow its banks. "How high up were you when this happened?" he asked. "Maybe 50 feet above the valley floor," Sarah replied. "We were trying to get to higher ground when—" A deep rumble interrupted her, felt as much as heard. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly, and loose pebbles skittered down the hillside. Marcus recognized the sound, a wall of water somewhere upstream, carrying debris and growing larger with each passing minute. Inside, now. He turned toward the cabin, his mind already racing through contingencies. 6 extra people would strain his resources, but leaving them to fend for themselves wasn't an option, not with unknown predators in the water, and the worst of the storm still hours away. The group didn't argue, filing quickly through the heavy wooden door into the cabin's warm interior. Marcus followed, barring the door behind them with a thick oak beam. Through the windows, he could see the creek continuing to rise, its angry brown water creeping steadily up the banks. "What's the plan?" Sarah asked, wrapping herself in a wool blanket from his emergency supplies. Marcus moved to a wall map marked with elevation lines and water flow patterns, his finger tracing the geography of the valley below. The old-timers who settled this area knew about seasonal flooding. They developed techniques to survive it, waterproofing methods using pine pitch and animal hide that could turn any shelter into a floating sanctuary. He turned to face the group, his expression grim. "But first, we need to figure out what's down there in the water, because if those things can survive in flood conditions, they're going to be a lot more dangerous once the whole valley is underwater." The screaming started at dawn. Marcus bolted upright in his sleeping bag, the sound cutting through the steady drumming of rain on his cabin's metal roof. It wasn't the wind, he knew every voice the mountain made, and this was human terror. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the covered porch, scanning the tree line through sheets of rain. The creek that normally whispered past his property now roared like a freight train, swollen to 3 times its usual width. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. There, stumbling down the muddy slope toward his cabin, was a woman in torn hiking gear. Behind her, barely visible through the downpour, 2 more figures struggled through the underbrush. "Help us!" she screamed when she spotted him. "Please, God, help us!" Marcus hesitated. He'd chosen this remote corner of the Cascades specifically to avoid moments like this. But the woman collapsed 20 feet from his porch, and something deeper than his misanthropy kicked in. He splashed through the mud and hauled her to her feet. Up close, he could see the raw panic in her eyes, not just fear of the storm, but something else entirely. "How many of you?" he shouted over the rain. 5 total. 2 others are still up there. She pointed toward the ridge, where the hiking trail wound through dense forest. "We got separated when the water started rising so fast." The other 2 survivors reached them, a middle-aged man with a gash across his forehead and a teenager who couldn't stop shaking. Marcus ushered them all onto his porch. "I'm Sarah," the woman gasped. "That's Dr. Chen and his son Michael. We were doing a 3-day hike when this storm hit. Our guide said it would just be scattered showers." "Your guide was an idiot," Marcus said bluntly. "This is a 100-year flood. Maybe worse. The whole valley's going to be underwater by nightfall." Dr. Chen looked up sharply. "How can you be certain?" Marcus gestured toward the mountainside where dozens of small streams had appeared overnight, carving new channels down the slope. "See how the soil's already saturated? And listen to that creek. It's not even close to peak yet. When the runoff from the upper elevations hits..." He didn't need to finish. They could all see how the landscape was transforming before their eyes. "We have to get the others," Sarah said. "Jenny and Tom are still out there." "No." Marcus's voice was flat. "Going up that trail now is suicide. The ground's unstable, visibility is maybe 10 feet, and those streams are turning into death traps. We can't just leave them." Something in her voice, the same desperate loyalty he'd once heard in a different place, a different life, made him reconsider. He studied the terrain, calculating routes and risks with a tactical precision that had kept him alive in places where most men died. "There might be a way," he said finally, "but we do this my way, with my equipment, or we don't do it at all." He led them inside his cabin, which was sparse but meticulously organized. Military surplus gear hung on pegs along the walls, and mason jars filled with preserved food lined sturdy shelves. But what caught their attention was the collection of bottles and containers arranged on a workbench. Pine tar, beeswax, various oils and resins. "What is all this?" Michael asked, speaking for the first time. "Insurance," Marcus replied, pulling down a leather jacket that gleamed with some kind of treatment. "Native Americans survived in this region for thousands of years before Gore-Tex existed. They knew how to make things truly waterproof." He handed each of them treated garments from a cedar chest, cloaks and wraps that felt surprisingly supple despite their obvious age. "My grandfather taught me the old techniques. Pine tar and bear fat, applied in layers with specific plant resins, takes weeks to cure properly." Sarah pulled on one of the cloaks. "This is incredible. It's like wearing liquid protection. It'll keep you alive in conditions that would kill you otherwise," Marcus said. "But there's something else you need to know." He paused, weighing how much to tell them. The scratches on the trees near the creek weren't from storm debris. The unnatural silence of the forest wasn't just from animals seeking shelter. And the way the water seemed to move sometimes, with purpose rather than simple current. "This isn't the first time the valley has flooded like this," he said carefully. "Local tribes have stories about what happens when the old places go underwater. Things that usually stay hidden in the deep pools and cave systems get forced up into the open." Dr. Chen frowned. "What kind of things?" Before Marcus could answer, another scream echoed across the water, closer this time, from the direction of the swollen creek. But this cry had an odd quality, almost like an echo of an echo, as if the sound itself was being distorted by something in the water. Marcus grabbed his rifle and checked the action, the kind that hunt when the barriers between worlds get washed away. The wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. She pressed herself against the rocky overhang where Marcus had led them, watching him work with materials that seemed impossibly ancient, yet perfectly suited for their dire situation. Marcus moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before, his weathered hands coating strips of bark with a dark, viscous substance he'd extracted from a pouch at his belt. The mixture gave off a sharp, resinous smell that cut through the mountain air. "Pine pitch mixed with charcoal and bear fat," he explained without looking up, sensing her curiosity. "My grandfather's recipe, waterproofed Blackfoot shelters for generations before Gore-Tex was even a dream." Thunder crashed overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Behind them, the injured hiker, David, she'd learned, groaned softly where Tom knelt beside him, trying to keep pressure on the makeshift bandage around his leg. "How much longer?" Tom called out, his voice tight with worry. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he held up one of the treated bark sheets, testing its flexibility. Water beaded and rolled off its surface like mercury. "These need to cure for another few minutes. The chemical reaction—" A sound cut through his explanation, low, guttural, and definitely not human. It seemed to come from the direction of the rising creek below them, though the growing darkness made it impossible to see clearly. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. What was that? Marcus had gone completely still, his head tilted as he listened. For a long moment, only the sound of increasing rainfall filled the air. Then it came again, closer this time, accompanied by what sounded like something large moving through water. "We need to move, now." Marcus began gathering his materials with swift, practiced motions. "The shelter will have to do, but you said—" "I said it needed more time. I didn't say it wouldn't work." His eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her stomach drop. Fear. This man who seemed afraid of nothing was genuinely afraid. Tom helped David to his feet, the injured man's face pale with pain and exhaustion. "I can't carry him much farther," Tom whispered. "You won't have to." Marcus had fashioned a crude but functional lean-to using the treated bark sheets and several sturdy branches. Water ran off the improvised shelter in steady streams rather than seeping through. "Get him inside, all of you." Another sound echoed through the canyon, a wet, sliding noise that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Sarah's mind raced, trying to rationalize what they were hearing. Rock slide? Debris from the storm? But even as she considered these possibilities, some primitive part of her brain was screaming that this was something else entirely. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what's out there?" He was securing the edges of their shelter with quick, efficient knots. Local legends talk about things that live in the deep pools, things that come out when the water rises. I always figured it was just stories to keep kids away from flash flood zones. The creek below them was no longer a creek. In the span of 20 minutes, it had transformed into a raging torrent that reflected the occasional lightning flash like a serpent's scales. And something was moving beneath that surface, something large enough to create wakes against the current. David suddenly gripped Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "There," he gasped, pointing into the storm. "In the water. Do you see it?" Sarah squinted through the rain and darkness. For a moment she saw nothing but the chaotic churning of floodwater. Then lightning flashed and her breath caught. Something smooth and dark had broken the surface near the opposite bank, too large to be a log, too fluid to be debris. "Jesus," Tom breathed. "What the hell is that thing?" Marcus pulled the last corner of their shelter tight and ushered them all inside. The space was cramped but dry, and the ancient waterproofing held against the increasingly violent downpour. "Keep your voices down," he instructed. "Sound carries over water." As if in response to his words, that low, guttural call came again, much closer now. It was answered by another from upstream, and then another from across the swollen creek. Whatever was out there, they weren't alone. Sarah found herself thinking about the ranger's warning, about how hikers sometimes went missing in these mountains during flood season. She'd assumed it was the water itself that claimed them. Swift currents, hypothermia, getting swept away in the chaos. She'd never considered that something might be hunting in the floodwaters. Outside their fragile shelter, the storm raged with increasing fury, and something ancient stirred in the rising depths below them. The beam from Marcus's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing another set of tracks pressed deep into the muddy shoreline. These weren't human. The prints were massive, clawed and filled with murky water that reflected the light like black mirrors. "Jesus Christ," whispered Jake, his voice barely audible over the steady drumming of rain against the cave mouth. "What the hell made those?" Elena crouched beside the tracks, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. The prints were unlike anything in her field guides, too large for a bear, too deep for anything that should exist in these mountains. She pulled out her phone to photograph them, but the device remained stubbornly dead despite Marcus's earlier attempts to revive it. "We need to move deeper into the cave system," Marcus said, shouldering his pack. The waterproof containers he'd crafted from pine pitch and animal hide creaked softly as he adjusted the straps. "Whatever made these tracks is drawn to the water. The higher we go, the safer we'll be." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the emergency shelter Marcus had constructed from salvaged materials and his ancient weatherproofing techniques. "How do you know what it wants? How do you know anything about this thing?" Marcus's jaw tightened. The others didn't need to know about the stories his grandfather had told him, tales passed down through generations of mountain people who'd learned to fear certain storms. Stories of things that rode the floods, creatures that emerged when the old barriers between worlds grew thin. "I know enough," he said simply. "We move now, while it's still hunting in the lower waters." Thunder crashed overhead, so violent that loose rocks tumbled from the cave ceiling. The storm was intensifying, and with it, the water level continued to rise. Through the cave opening, they could see the lake expanding, swallowing trees and boulders with hungry efficiency. Carlos struggled to his feet, favoring his injured ankle. "I can't keep up much longer. Maybe we should just stay here and wait it out." "No." Marcus's voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "This cave floods completely within the next few hours. I've seen the high water marks. We go up or we drown." Elena studied the survivalist's weathered face in the flashlight's glow. There was something he wasn't telling them, something that went beyond practical survival knowledge. Marcus, what aren't you sharing with us? You know more about this situation than you're letting on. Before he could answer, a sound echoed from the water outside, a low, resonant call that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. It wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human, but something that occupied the terrifying space between. The group froze. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. Carlos stopped breathing altogether. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the splash of something massive moving through the floodwaters. Marcus quickly extinguished his flashlight, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Nobody moves," he breathed. "Nobody breathes loud." They waited in the suffocating blackness as something explored the area just outside their shelter. The splashing grew more methodical, more purposeful. Whatever was out there was searching for them. Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Her scientific mind tried to categorize what they were experiencing, but every rational explanation fell short. The sound, the tracks, the way Marcus spoke about it, this was beyond her understanding of the natural world. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the splashing began to recede, moving further down the shoreline. Marcus waited another full minute before risking the flashlight again. "It's gone for now," he said, "but it'll be back. These things are persistent hunters. We use this window to get to higher ground." "These things?" Sarah's voice cracked. "You're talking like there might be more than one." Marcus was already gathering their supplies, his movements efficient and practiced. The waterproof bundles he'd created were holding up perfectly despite the moisture, a testament to techniques refined over generations. The storm's bringing more than just water. Every few decades, when the conditions are right, the old boundaries weaken. Things that usually stay deep underground get swept up in the floods. Jake shook his head in disbelief. "You're talking about monsters, actual monsters." "I'm talking about survival." Marcus handed each of them a makeshift torch wrapped in pine pitch cloth. "Call them whatever you want, but they're real, they're hungry, and they're not going away until the water recedes. That could take days." Another distant call echoed across the flooded valley, answered by a second voice from the opposite direction. The sounds overlapped and harmonized in a way that made their bones ache. "Two of them," Elena whispered. "At least," Marcus confirmed. He shouldered his pack and started toward the deeper passages. "Now you understand why we can't wait this out. They're coordinating, and they know we're here." The group gathered their courage and followed him into the darkness, leaving behind the relative safety of their shelter for the unknown dangers of the cave system above. The cave system stretched deeper into the mountain than Marcus had remembered, its limestone walls weeping condensation that echoed their footsteps in hollow drips. He led the group single file through passages barely wide enough for their shoulders, the flickering light from Sarah's phone casting dancing shadows that made the rock formations look like sleeping giants. "How much further?" David whispered, his voice tight with claustrophobia. Marcus held up a weathered hand for silence. Something wasn't right. The air current that should have been flowing from the deeper chambers had shifted, carrying with it a smell that made his stomach clench, the metallic tang of blood mixed with something else, something rotten and wild. They emerged into a cathedral-sized chamber where stalactites hung like ancient teeth. Marcus had used this space as a supply cache for years, but now his carefully arranged provisions lay scattered across the stone floor. Torn fabric from his waterproof tarps fluttered in the strange breeze, and deep gouges scarred the cave walls. "Jesus," Riley breathed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "What happened here?" Marcus knelt beside the remains of a storage container, running his fingers along claw marks that were too large, too deliberate to belong to any mountain predator he knew. The metal had been peeled back like paper, and whatever had been inside was gone. "We can't stay here," he said, standing abruptly. But even as the words left his mouth, a low rumble filled the chamber. Not thunder this time, but something else, something alive. Emma grabbed her father's arm. "Dad, what is that?" The sound came again, closer now, reverberating through the stone walls with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in their chests. Marcus clicked off Sarah's phone light, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Nobody move," he whispered. Nobody breathe loud. In the suffocating blackness, they could hear it more clearly, a wet, sliding sound, like something massive dragging itself through water. The smell grew stronger, accompanied now by a rhythmic splashing that suggested whatever was making the noise was moving through the flooded lower passages. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. The old-timers in the valley had stories, legends he dismissed as folklore meant to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness, tales of something that lived in the deepest caves, something that only emerged when the waters rose high enough to carry it from its ancient hiding places. A splash echoed from the passage they'd just used, then another, closer. The back exit, Marcus breathed, barely audible. "Follow the right wall, stay low." They moved like ghosts through the darkness, hands pressed against the stone, feet testing each step. Behind them, the splashing sounds grew more frequent, more urgent, as if whatever was hunting them had caught their scent. Sarah's breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "I can't see anything. I can't—" "You don't need to see," Marcus whispered. "Trust the stone. It'll guide you." The passage narrowed again, forcing them to move single file. Marcus could feel the others behind him, their fear palpable in the confined space. The ancient waterproofing techniques his grandfather had taught him included more than just practical knowledge. They included an understanding of how water moved through rock, how caves breathed, how to read the mountain's hidden language. That language was screaming warnings now. Water began seeping through cracks in the walls, not the slow condensation from before, but active flow. The storm above was driving runoff into the cave system faster than it could drain, and they were being caught between rising floodwaters and whatever predator was using those same waters to hunt. "There," Marcus whispered, spotting a faint grey outline ahead, natural light filtering through a crack in the mountain face. "Emergency exit." But as they approached the narrow opening, the sounds behind them changed. The wet sliding became rapid movement, accompanied by a clicking noise that reminded Marcus of insects, but magnified 100 times over. "Go, go, go!" he hissed, pushing Emma toward the opening first. She squeezed through the crack with Riley close behind. David struggled with the narrow space, his bulk making the passage difficult, but adrenaline drove him forward. Sarah followed, then Marcus began his own squeeze through the opening. Behind him, something large struck the passage wall with enough force to shake loose debris. A sound emerged from the darkness. Not quite a roar, not quite a hiss, but something that seemed designed to paralyze prey with terror. Marcus felt claws rake across his boot as he pulled himself through the opening, the waterproof leather his grandfather had taught him to make, saving his foot from whatever had just tried to grab him. They tumbled out onto a narrow ledge high on the mountain face, rain immediately soaking them despite the overhang. Below, the valley had become a churning lake, and the water was still rising. But at least they could see what was hunting them now, and Marcus wished they couldn't. The ancient waterproofing technique had bought them precious time, but Marcus knew it wouldn't hold forever. As he worked by lamplight, applying another layer of pine pitch and charcoal mixture to the cabin's walls, his ears remained tuned to every sound beyond their temporary sanctuary. The storm continued its relentless assault, but underneath the howling wind and driving rain, something else moved through the darkness. Sarah sat near the small fire, her injured ankle elevated, watching Marcus work with methodical precision. The other hikers, Tom, Elena, and Jake, huddled together, their earlier panic replaced by an uneasy quiet. They'd all heard it now. The splashing that didn't match the rhythm of falling rain, the occasional scrape of something hard against stone. "How long will this hold?" Elena whispered, gesturing at the sealed walls where black mixture gleamed wetly in the firelight. Marcus paused, testing a section with his fingers. "Through the night, if we're lucky. Maybe longer." He didn't mention that the rising water level was already lapping at the cabin's foundation. Soon, even his grandfather's techniques wouldn't be enough. A loud crack echoed from outside, followed by a splash that sent ripples against the walls. Jake scrambled backward from the door. "What was that?" "Probably a tree branch," Tom said, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus set down his tools and moved to the single window he'd left unsealed. Through the storm-lashed glass, he could see nothing but driving rain and dark water reflecting their lamplight. But something had definitely broken nearby, something large. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, turning back to the group. "This cabin isn't going to stay dry much longer. The water's rising faster than I expected." Sarah struggled to sit up straighter. "You have a plan, right? Some way to get us out of here?" Before Marcus could answer, a new sound cut through the storm. A rhythmic tapping against the cabin's walls. Tap, tap, tap. It started near the door, then moved along the wall toward the window. Everyone froze, watching Marcus's face for any sign of recognition or reassurance. The tapping stopped directly beneath the window. Marcus grabbed his rifle and motioned for silence. He'd heard stories from the old-timers about things that lived in the deep mountain pools, creatures that only emerged during the worst floods. He'd dismissed them as folklore, the kind of tales that grew larger with each telling around winter fires. Now, listening to something deliberately testing their defenses, he wondered if his grandfather's warnings had been more literal than he'd understood. A shadow passed across the window, too large and moving too purposefully to be debris carried by the current. It paused there for a moment, and Marcus could swear he saw the outline of something peering in, studying them. "Nobody move," he whispered. The shadow shifted, and suddenly the tapping resumed, more aggressive now, as if whatever was outside had decided they were worth investigating further. The waterproofed walls shuddered under repeated impacts, and Marcus watched with growing alarm as small cracks appeared in his careful work. Elena whimpered. "It's trying to get in." Jake stood up abruptly. "That's it. I'm not staying here to be eaten by some monster. There has to be another way out." "Sit down," Marcus commanded, his voice sharp. "Panic gets you killed faster than anything out there." But Jake was already moving toward the back of the cabin, searching frantically for another exit. His shoulder slammed into a weak section of wall where the waterproofing hadn't fully set, and the pine-pitch mixture cracked, allowing a thin stream of muddy water to seep through. The change was immediate. The tapping stopped, replaced by a sound like heavy breathing or air being forced through water. Whatever was outside had detected the breach. Marcus cursed and rushed to repair the damage, but it was too late. The crack widened under pressure from the rising water, and more streams began finding their way through gaps in the wall. Their sanctuary was failing. "Everyone grab whatever you can carry," he ordered. "We're leaving." "In this storm?" Tom protested. "That's suicide." "Staying here definitely is." Marcus shouldered his pack and checked his rifle. "There's higher ground about half a mile north. If we move fast and stay together, we can make it." Sarah struggled to her feet. "I'll slow you down." Then we all slowed down. He moved to the door, listening for any sound from outside. The water was definitely higher now, probably up to his knees. Whatever's out there, it seems to hunt by detecting movement through the water. If we can stay calm and move deliberately, we might avoid attracting attention. He placed his hand on the door latch, took a deep breath, and looked back at the group. 4 terrified faces stared back at him, trusting him to lead them through a nightmare that defied explanation. "Stay close, stay quiet, and whatever you see out there, don't run." The latch clicked open. The ancient symbols carved into the cave wall seemed to pulse in the flickering light of Marcus's torch. Sarah traced her fingers along the weathered grooves, feeling the deliberate precision of each mark etched into the stone generations ago. "These aren't random," she whispered, her voice echoing in the narrow chamber. "Look at this pattern here. It's showing water levels, seasonal markers." Marcus crouched beside her, his weathered face tight with concentration. The storm continued its relentless assault outside, but something in these markings had captured his attention completely. The old ones knew. They lived through floods like this before. Behind them, The other survivors huddled around the small fire Jake had managed to coax to life using Marcus's flint and steel. The cave provided shelter, but dampness seeped through every crack, and their clothes remained stubbornly wet despite the heat. "Marcus," Elena called softly from the cave mouth, where she maintained watch. "The water's still rising. Whatever's down there, it's getting closer to our level." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The thing that had taken David and nearly claimed Jake still lurked somewhere in the churning waters below. She'd caught glimpses of it during their desperate climb to the cave, something massive and wrong, moving with impossible speed through the flood. "Here," Marcus pointed to a section of symbols that depicted what looked like a barrier or wall. "They built something, a way to control the water flow during the worst floods." "You mean like a dam?" Jake asked, limping over despite his injured leg. "Not exactly." Marcus studied the carvings more carefully. "More like a redirection system. See these channels? They're showing how to guide the water away from the inhabited areas." Sarah's heart sank. "But we're not in an inhabited area. We're trapped in a cave while something hunts us." A low rumble echoed through the chamber, different from the constant thunder outside. The sound came from below, from the flooded depths. Elena backed away from the cave entrance as ripples spread across the water's surface. "It's testing," Marcus said grimly. "Probing for weakness." "What is it?" Jake demanded. "What the hell is down there?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "I've lived in these mountains for 15 years. Heard stories from the old-timers, the ones who remember when their grandfathers still talked about the deep waters. Stories about what? Something that shouldn't exist, something that got trapped down there when they changed the river's course back in the 1800s. Marcus gestured toward the symbols. "The tribes knew. That's why they built the redirection system, not just for floods, but to keep it contained." Sarah felt her scientific skepticism warring with the evidence of her own eyes. She'd seen the thing move, witnessed its predatory intelligence. Trapped. How long? Long enough to get hungry, long enough to evolve. Another rumble shook the cave, stronger this time. Loose stones rattled down from the ceiling, and the water level at the cave mouth rose another few inches. Elena pointed to a section of wall where water had begun to seep through. "We can't stay here. This whole system is compromised." Marcus nodded grimly. "The symbols show another way, a higher path, but it means going back into the water." "That's suicide," Jake protested. "That thing nearly got me the first time." "Maybe. But these markings show safe passages, places where the old ones could travel even during the worst floods." Marcus traced a complex pattern of lines and curves. They knew how to move without attracting its attention. Sarah studied the symbols, her mind racing. "You're talking about following a map that's hundreds of years old, based on the hope that whatever's down there follows the same hunting patterns as it did then. You have a better idea?" The water at the cave mouth suddenly churned, and something dark and massive passed just below the surface. Elena stumbled backward, her face pale. "It knows we're here." Marcus began gathering his pack, checking his waterproofed supplies. The symbols show timing patterns, when it hunts, when it rests. If the old knowledge holds true, we have maybe an hour window when it retreats to the deeper waters. "And if you're wrong?" Sarah asked. "Then we die here anyway, when this cave floods completely." Jake tested his injured leg, wincing. "How far to this safe passage?" "Half a mile through flooded terrain. We'll need to move fast and quiet." Marcus pulled out several lengths of rope, already treated with his pine pitch waterproofing. "And we stay connected. No one gets separated." The rumbling below grew more insistent, as if the creature sensed their preparations. Sarah watched the water level creep higher up the cave wall and realized they were out of choices. "When do we go?" she asked. Marcus consulted the symbols one more time, then looked toward the storm-darkened opening. "Now, before it decides to come up and get us." The creature's screech echoed through the canyon as Maya pressed herself against the slick rock wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the driving rain she could see Cade 20 feet below, his weathered hands working frantically to seal the last section of their makeshift shelter with pine resin and strips of birch bark. "How much longer?" she called down, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Almost there," he replied without looking up. "Keep watching the water." The flood had risen another 3 feet in the past hour, and Maya could see debris, broken branches, chunks of bark and things she didn't want to identify, swirling in the dark current. But it wasn't the rising water that made her stomach clench with fear. It was what moved beneath the surface. She'd caught glimpses of it twice now, a pale, elongated shape that cut through the water with unnatural grace, too large to be a fish, too fluid to be debris. And those sounds it made, a cross between a whale's song and a dying animal's cry, seemed to come from everywhere at once. Behind her, tucked into the narrow cave entrance Cade had found, the 3 remaining hikers huddled together. Tom's leg was getting worse, the makeshift splint Cade had fashioned already soaked through. Sarah kept mumbling prayers under her breath, while Jake stared out at the water with the hollow expression of someone who'd accepted his fate. "There," Cade announced, scrambling up the rock face with surprising agility for a man his age. "The barrier should hold for a few more hours, maybe longer if we're lucky." Maya helped pull him onto the ledge, noting how his hands shook, not from cold, but from exhaustion. "What about the creature? What is that thing?" Cade's jaw tightened, something that should have stayed buried. Before Maya could press him for more details, a tremendous splash erupted from the water below them. The creature breached the surface, and Maya got her first clear look at it. Easily 15 feet long, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched over powerful muscles. Its head was vaguely serpentine but wrong somehow, with too many eyes and a mouth that opened in impossible angles. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered from behind them. The thing seemed to hear him, its multiple eyes fixed on their position, and it let out another of those bone-chilling cries. Then it began to move toward the cliff face. "How can it climb?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "It's not climbing," Cade said grimly, shouldering his pack. "It's remembering." Maya watched in horror as the creature's body began to change, elongating and flattening. Appendages that looked almost like hands emerged from its sides, and it started pulling itself up the rock face with deliberate, practiced movements. "We need to move. Now." Cade was already helping Tom to his feet. "There's a passage at the back of the cave. It leads up to the old mining tunnels." "Mining tunnels?" Maya grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the cave entrance. "You didn't mention mining tunnels." "Because they're flooded. Were flooded." Cade grunted as he took most of Tom's weight. "But the water's rising fast enough that we might be able to swim through to higher ground." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "So our choices are stay here and get eaten by that thing, or dive into flooded tunnels and drown?" "The tunnels might be our only chance," Cade replied. "That creature, it's territorial. It won't follow us into confined spaces." "How do you know?" Maya demanded. But she was already following him deeper into the cave. "Because I've seen what it does to things that get trapped with it." The passage at the back of the cave was narrow and sloped upward at a steep angle. Maya could hear water rushing somewhere ahead, and the air grew thicker with moisture as they climbed. Behind them, the creature's cries grew louder, more frustrated. "There," Cade said, pointing his flashlight ahead. "The tunnel entrance." Maya's heart sank. The opening was completely submerged, dark water lapping at the cave ceiling. "How do we know there's air on the other side?" "We don't." Cade was already stripping off his outer jacket and securing his pack. "But I've been through these tunnels before, years ago. There are air pockets, chambers that should still be dry." "Should be?" Sarah grabbed his arm. "You're asking us to bet our lives on should be?" A scraping sound echoed from the cave entrance behind them, followed by that terrible cry. The creature had reached the ledge. Cade looked at each of them in turn, his weathered face grim but determined. "That thing killed 2 of your friends already. It's not going to stop until it's killed the rest of you. The tunnels are dangerous, but they're the only chance we've got." Maya stared at the dark water, then back toward the cave entrance where shadows were beginning to move. The choice was terrifying, but it wasn't really a choice at all. She took a deep breath and dove into the tunnel. The ancient shelter shuddered as another wave crashed against its reinforced walls, but Marcus's sealskin and pine pitch waterproofing held firm. Inside, the group huddled around a small fire, their faces illuminated by dancing shadows that made their exhaustion and fear more pronounced. Sarah checked her phone for the 100th time. Still no signal. "The water's still rising," Jake whispered, peering through a gap in the shelter's entrance. "At this rate, we'll be underwater by dawn." Marcus methodically checked his gear, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Not if we move to higher ground first. There's an old mining tunnel about half a mile east carved into the cliff face. If we can reach it—" "If?" Elena's voice cracked. "You mean when we reach it?" The survivalist's silence spoke volumes. Tom shifted uncomfortably, wincing as his injured ankle sent sharp pains up his leg. "What about those things in the water? We barely made it here alive." Marcus pulled out a leather-wrapped bundle, revealing several hand-carved bone implements, hooks, spears, and what looked like primitive knives. "My grandfather's fishing tools. He used to tell stories about the old days, when the valley would flood and strange things would surface. I always thought they were just tales." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Creatures that lived in the deep caves, in flooded mine shafts that were supposed to be sealed forever. The old-timers called them hollow swimmers, pale, elongated things that moved through water like liquid death." Marcus tested the edge of a bone blade. The mining company dynamited most of the underground chambers back in the 80s, but some of those tunnels run deeper than anyone mapped. A distant splash echoed across the valley, followed by something that might have been a call, low, warbling, definitely not human. Jake grabbed his backpack. "We need to leave, now." Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. Moving in complete darkness is suicide. We wait until there's enough light to see where we're stepping. Then we move fast and quiet." "How long?" Elena asked. 2 hours, maybe 3. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest. "What if we don't make it? What if those things find us first?" Marcus continued sharpening his grandfather's tools. "Then we fight." The fire crackled, consuming the last of their dry wood. Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, and the water level crept steadily higher. Every few minutes they heard splashes that seemed too deliberate, too purposeful to be debris. Tom struggled to his feet, testing his weight on his injured ankle. "I'm slowing everyone down. Maybe I should—" "Nobody gets left behind," Marcus interrupted. "We'll make a stretcher from branches and waterproof canvas. It'll float if we need it to." Elena stood and began organizing their meager supplies. "What else do we need to know about these creatures? How do we fight something we can't see coming?" "They hunt by vibration through the water," Marcus explained, wrapping the bone tools in strips of leather. "Moves smooth and steady, no sudden splashing, no panic. They're adapted to total darkness, but they've been trapped underground for decades. The surface world will confuse them at first." "At first?" Jake demanded. "They'll learn. They're smart enough to have survived this long." Sarah picked up one of the smaller bone implements, a curved hook with a sharp point. "My grandfather was a commercial fisherman. These look like they're designed for something a lot bigger than trout." Marcus met her eyes. "Your grandfather was a wise man to teach you about fishing gear." "Yes, these were made for hunting larger prey, much larger." Another splash, closer this time, followed by a scraping sound against the shelter's exterior walls. Everyone froze. The scraping continued, methodical, testing, like something was trying to understand the structure they'd built. Marcus slowly reached for his largest bone spear, motioning for the others to stay absolutely still. The sound moved along the wall, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic clicking, then silence. They waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, Marcus relaxed slightly. "It's gone, but it'll be back," he whispered. "They're curious creatures. It was examining our shelter, learning about us." Elena shivered despite the fire's warmth. Learning what? How many we are, how we smell, how we move. Marcus began distributing the primitive weapons among the group. When we leave here, we won't have the advantage of surprise anymore. Jake checked his watch. How much longer until we can move? Marcus looked toward the shelter entrance, where the first faint hints of grey light were beginning to filter through. Not long now. Everyone needs to understand, once we enter that water, we're in their territory. Move like your life depends on it, because it does. The scraping sound returned, circling their shelter now, accompanied by soft splashing that suggested more than one creature had arrived to investigate. Their time was running out faster than they'd hoped. The sound hit them first, a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to rise from the flooded valley below. Marcus felt it in his chest, a vibration that made his ribs ache and his teeth clench involuntarily. Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging through the waterproofed fabric of his jacket. "What is that?" she whispered, though her voice barely carried over the rain. Marcus pressed himself against the cave wall, peering down at the dark water that now stretched like a black mirror across what had once been the valley floor. The sound came again, longer this time, echoing off the canyon walls with an otherworldly resonance that made the hair on his neck stand up. "I don't know," he admitted, and the uncertainty in his voice sent a chill through the group huddled behind them. In all his years in these mountains, through storms and floods and wildlife encounters, he'd never heard anything like it. Jake limped forward, his makeshift crutch scraping against the stone. Could be the water draining somewhere, underground caverns opening up or something. Marcus wanted to believe that. The rational part of his mind seized on the explanation, shifting geology, water pressure, acoustics playing tricks in the storm, but his gut told him otherwise. That sound had purpose behind it, intelligence. A splash echoed from their left, where the cave mouth opened toward the flooded eastern slope. Everyone froze. The rain created a constant patter of disturbance on the water's surface, but this had been different, deliberate. "Stay back from the opening," Marcus commanded, his voice taking on the authority that had kept him alive through decades of wilderness survival. He pulled his waterproof pack closer and checked the ancient sealing techniques he'd used on their makeshift shelter. The pine pitch and bark strips were holding, but water was beginning to seep through cracks in the rock face. Elena pressed herself against Tom, both of them shivering despite the relatively dry conditions in their refuge. "Marcus," she said, "there's something I haven't told you about why we were really hiking up here." He turned sharply. "What are you talking about?" "The university sent us to investigate the geological surveys from the 1960s. There were reports of unusual formations in this valley, chambers that the survey teams couldn't fully explore." Her voice shook, whether from cold or fear. "They found evidence of something living in the underground water systems, something that predated human settlement by thousands of years." The thrumming sound came again, closer now. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. "And you thought now was a good time to mention this?" "I thought it was just academic curiosity. Legends and folklore about water spirits, the kind of stories every remote area has." Elena's words tumbled out rapidly. "But the flood, the way the water rose so fast, it's not just the storm, is it?" Before Marcus could respond, the water level at their cave entrance began to rise with alarming speed. Not the gradual increase they'd been tracking, but a sudden surge that brought the dark surface up another 3 feet in less than a minute. "We need to move higher," he said, grabbing his pack. "Now." But as they prepared to evacuate their shelter, something broke the surface of the water near the cave mouth. At first, Marcus thought it might be debris, a log or piece of equipment swept along by the current. Then it moved with unmistakable purpose, cutting through the water toward them. "Oh, God," Sarah breathed. The shape was massive, easily 20 feet long, moving just beneath the surface with an undulating motion that spoke of powerful muscles and predatory grace. Occasionally, a section would break the waterline, sleek, dark hide that seemed to absorb the storm's dim light rather than reflect it. Marcus had seen bears, mountain lions, even the occasional wolf in his years of solitude. This was something else entirely, something that belonged to the deep places of the earth, awakened and driven upward by the rising waters. "The back of the cave," he whispered, motioning frantically for the others to retreat. "There's a narrow passage that leads up. It might connect to higher chambers." They moved as quietly as possible, but Jake's injury made stealth nearly impossible. Each scrape of his makeshift crutch seemed to echo like a gunshot in the confined space. The thrumming sound grew louder, and now they could hear the splash of water as the creature approached their refuge. Marcus ushered the students into the narrow passage, using every technique he knew to mask their scent and movement. The ancient waterproofing methods that had kept them dry might now be the only thing standing between them and whatever had been sleeping in the flooded depths below. As the last of them squeezed into the passage, a shadow fell across the cave entrance. Through the gap, Marcus caught a glimpse of something that would haunt his dreams, if he lived long enough to have them. Ancient eyes, intelligent and hungry, scanning the space they'd just abandoned. The hunt had begun. The ancient sealant held against the torrential downpour, but Marcus could hear something else cutting through the storm's roar, a sound that made his blood freeze. The distinctive splash-drag pattern echoed from multiple directions now, growing closer with each passing minute. "They're surrounding us," he whispered to Elena, who crouched beside him near the shelter's entrance. The waterproofed canvas walls trembled under the wind's assault, but the structure remained intact. Inside, the remaining hikers huddled together, their faces pale in the flickering light of their emergency lantern. Elena's grip tightened on the makeshift spear they'd fashioned from a hiking pole and her survival knife. "How many do you think?" Marcus listened intently, passing the sounds beyond the storm. "At least 4, maybe more." He checked his own weapon, a heavy branch he'd hardened over their small fire, its point sharpened to a lethal edge. The water's rising faster now. Another hour and this ridge will be an island. Through the translucent sections of their shelter, shadows moved in the grey dawn light. The creatures had learned to use the storm as cover, their movements becoming more coordinated with each encounter. Marcus had faced predators before, but nothing like this, nothing that adapted so quickly to new tactics. Sarah Chen pressed herself against the far wall, her injured ankle wrapped in strips torn from her jacket. "What are they waiting for?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "The water," Marcus replied grimly. "They know we can't stay here much longer." He studied the rising flood through a gap in the shelter's wall. The murky water now lapped at the base of their ridge, carrying debris from the valley below. Trees, pieces of buildings, and things he didn't want to identify swept past in the current. A violent impact struck the shelter's side, sending everyone scrambling. The canvas held, but Marcus heard the distinctive scraping sound of claws testing their defenses. Elena raised her spear, positioning herself between the noise and the other hikers. "The emergency beacon," David whispered urgently. "Any response?" Marcus shook his head. "Not through this storm. Even if rescue teams are mobilized, they can't reach us until the weather clears." He didn't mention what they all knew. That might be too late. Another impact, this time from the opposite side. The creatures were probing for weaknesses, testing different angles of attack. Marcus admired their intelligence even as it terrified him. These weren't mindless beasts driven by simple hunger. They were calculating, patient hunters. "We need to move," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "This position is too defensive. We're trapped." Marcus nodded, already forming a plan. "There's higher ground about 200 meters north, an old mining platform cut into the cliff face. If we can reach it—" A sound like tearing fabric interrupted him. One of the creatures had found a weak point where 2 sections of canvas overlapped. Its claw pierced through, withdrawing immediately when Elena jabbed at it with her spear. "That settles it," Marcus said, shouldering his pack. "We move now, before they coordinate a full assault." He turned to the group. "Stay close, move fast, and whatever happens, don't look back. Elena and I will cover the rear." They dismantled the shelter quickly, salvaging what waterproofing material they could carry. The ancient pitch and tree resin had proven invaluable. Without it, they'd have been exposed to the elements hours ago. Marcus sealed the containers carefully, knowing they'd need every drop for whatever shelter they could construct on the mining platform. The moment they emerged into the open, the creatures attacked. Marcus caught a glimpse of the first one as it launched itself from the flooded brush below, sleek, powerful, moving with deadly purpose through the rising water. He thrust forward with his spear, feeling it connect solidly. The creature shrieked and fell back, but two more emerged from different angles. "Run!" Elena shouted, driving her own weapon into something that had tried to flank them. Dark blood mixed with the storm water at her feet. They fought a running battle across the ridge, slipping on wet stone and struggling through knee-deep water that hadn't been there an hour before. Sarah limped gamely between David and Tom, all of them moving faster than Marcus had thought possible under the circumstances. The mining platform appeared through the rain like a promised sanctuary, a concrete shelf carved into the cliff face, equipped with rusted equipment and what looked like the entrance to a tunnel. It sat 15 feet above the current water level, though Marcus could see the flood marks on the stone, indicating it wouldn't stay dry much longer. "There!" he called out, pointing toward a series of metal rungs embedded in the cliff face. "Climb!" Behind them, the splash drag sounds multiplied as more creatures emerged from the depths. The real hunt was just beginning, and soon they'd have nowhere left to run. The creature's massive form broke the surface 20 yards away, water cascading from its scaled hide like a waterfall. Marcus had seen enough predators in his years to recognize the intelligence burning in those ancient eyes, and the hunger that came with it. "Nobody move," he whispered, though his own body betrayed him with a slight trembling. The waterproofed shelter held firm beneath their feet, but it suddenly felt as fragile as paper. Elena gripped his arm, her medical training warring with primal terror. The hikers behind them had gone statue still, understanding that their lives hung by the thinnest of threads. Only the sound of lapping water and their ragged breathing filled the air. The creature's head swiveled toward them with deliberate slowness. Its neck alone was longer than their entire raft, covered in overlapping scales that gleamed like wet obsidian. Marcus had heard the old stories from his grandfather, tales dismissed as folklore until this moment. The valley's deepest secrets had awakened with the rising waters. "The trees," Marcus breathed, barely audible. "When I signal, we go for the trees." Sarah's voice cracked behind them. "We'll never make it." "We will." Marcus's hand found the emergency flare in his pack. One shot. That was all he'd have to create enough confusion to reach the old growth pines 30 feet away. Their branches hung low enough to climb, their trunks thick enough to support everyone. The creature submerged again, leaving only ripples to mark its passage. Marcus counted heartbeats, his own thundering like a war drum. 10 seconds. 20. The water around their shelter remained deceptively calm. Where did it? The raft lurched violently sideways as something massive brushed against its underside. Marcus grabbed Elena to keep her from tumbling into the water as the whole structure pitched and rolled. The ancient waterproofing techniques held, the birch bark and pine pitch construction flexing but not breaking. "Now!" Marcus shouted, firing the flare high into the air. The brilliant red light exploded overhead, casting everything in hellish shadows. As one, they abandoned the shelter and plunged toward the trees. The water was deeper than Marcus had hoped, chest high and moving fast. He heard Elena splash beside him, her breathing sharp but determined. Behind them, the hikers thrashed through the current in desperate flight. A tremendous roar split the air, part rage and part triumph. Marcus didn't look back. His hands found the lowest pine branch just as something enormous surged past his legs, close enough to feel the displacement of water. He hauled himself up with strength born of pure terror, then reached down to pull Elena to safety. "Climb!" he shouted to the others. "Keep climbing!" Tom, the stocky engineer, was struggling in the current. The creature's head rose from the water behind him like a nightmare emerging from the depths. Marcus grabbed a dead branch and hurled it with all his strength, striking the beast between the eyes. The distraction was enough. Tom lunged forward and grasped the branch Marcus extended, scrambling up the tree with surprising agility for his size. Sarah and Jake followed, their teenage athleticism serving them well in the vertical escape. From their perch 15 feet above the water, they finally got a clear view of their pursuer. The creature was even larger than Marcus had imagined, easily 40 feet from snout to tail, with powerful limbs that suggested it was equally at home on land or in water. Its hide bore scars from battles fought in an age when such beasts ruled the earth unchallenged. "What is that thing?" Elena whispered. "Something that should have stayed buried," Marcus replied, watching as the creature circled the tree with patient malevolence. The old-timers talked about things sleeping in the deep caves, waiting for the water to rise high enough to wake them. The creature's intelligence was evident in how it tested the tree's stability, pushing against the trunk with measured force. The ancient pine groaned but held firm, its roots reaching deep into bedrock laid down millennia ago. "It's not going to leave, is it?" Jake's voice carried the thin edge of panic. Marcus studied their situation with practiced assessment. The flare was already burning out, darkness creeping back across the water. Their emergency supplies were on the abandoned raft, now drifting away into the night. The tree was secure for now, but the water level was still rising. "It's testing us," he said quietly, "seeing how long we can hold out." Elena met his eyes in the fading light. "Then we don't wait. We take the fight to it." The words surprised him. In her gaze, he saw not the frightened urban professional who'd stumbled into his world days ago, but someone who'd found her own strength in the crucible of survival. The others looked to them both now, understanding that their fate lay in whatever desperate plan was taking shape. Below them, the creature settled into a patient vigil, its prehistoric intelligence calculating their inevitable surrender to exhaustion, hunger, or hypothermia. But it had never faced prey that refused to accept defeat. The ancient birch bark shelter creaked against the wind as Marcus finished sealing the final seam with pine resin. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, even as his mind raced through calculations they couldn't afford to get wrong. The water had risen another 2 feet since dawn, and the things beneath the surface were growing bolder. "How much higher can it go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. She cradled her injured ankle, wrapped in strips of waterproof hide Marcus had prepared using techniques his grandfather had learned from the Ojibwe. Marcus peered through a gap in their shelter's wall. The valley had transformed into a vast lake, with only the highest ridges and ancient pine groves still visible above the churning surface. Another 10 feet, maybe 15 before it crests the eastern ridge. Tom pressed against the back wall, his face pale. The ranger station was broadcasting about search and rescue operations, but that was hours ago, before the radio went dead. "No one's coming," Marcus said flatly. "Not in this. We're on our own until the water recedes." A low splash echoed from somewhere close by, followed by a sound like branches snapping, but Marcus knew no trees grew where that sound had originated. Elena tensed beside him, her hand instinctively moving to the sharpened stick he'd given her. "They're testing the shelter," she whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. The creatures had been probing their defenses for hours, but the combination of elevated position and waterproof walls seemed to confuse them. The ancient techniques that kept water out apparently also masked human scent, at least partially. Through the storm, another sound reached them, a rhythmic scraping against bark. Something large was climbing the massive pine that anchored their shelter's eastern corner. Marcus felt the tree shudder as claws found purchase in its ancient bark. "Everyone move to the center," he ordered quietly. "Stay low." The scraping grew louder, accompanied by a wet, huffing breath that definitely didn't belong to any animal Marcus recognized. He'd spent 40 years in these mountains and knew every creature that called them home. This was something else entirely. A shadow passed over their shelter's roof, too large and moving wrong to be natural. Marcus gripped his grandfather's bone-handled knife, its blade darkened with the same pine pitch that sealed their walls. The old man had told stories about times when the waters rose and brought things up from the deep places. Marcus had thought them just stories. The scraping stopped. In the sudden silence, broken only by rain hammering their shelter, Marcus could hear 4 hearts beating too fast, his own included. Then came a new sound, a wet sliding like something massive lowering itself down the tree trunk. Elena grabbed his arm. "Marcus," she breathed, pointing toward a section of wall where the waterproof hide was beginning to bulge inward. Something was pressing against it from outside, testing its strength. Marcus moved carefully toward his pack, retrieving a small clay pot sealed with beeswax. His grandfather's fire starter, not just any fire but one that could burn even when wet. Some of the old techniques had purposes beyond mere survival. The bulging intensified. Whatever was outside had found what it thought was a weak point and was applying steady pressure. The hide stretched but held, the ancient tanning methods proving their worth. "When I give the signal," Marcus whispered. Everyone moved to the western wall, fast and quiet. Tom started to ask something, but Elena shushed him with a sharp gesture. She understood. They all did, on some primal level that bypassed rational thought. They were being hunted. Marcus worked quickly, mixing pine resin with the special tinder from his grandfather's pot. The combination would create a flame hot enough to burn underwater, or at least long enough to create a distraction. He positioned himself near the bulging wall section, waiting. The pressure suddenly released, and heavy splashing indicated movement around their shelter's perimeter. Hunting behavior, testing different approaches. "Now," Marcus whispered. They moved as one, slipping across their small space with barely a sound. Marcus lit his prepared mixture and held it ready. The flame caught immediately, burning with an unusually bright white light that seemed to push back shadows that had no business existing. A roar shattered the night, part rage, part pain, as if the light itself was somehow harmful to whatever lurked outside. Heavy splashing retreated rapidly, growing fainter as distance increased. "What the hell was that?" Tom gasped. Marcus extinguished his flame carefully, preserving what remained of the mixture. "Something that doesn't like fire. Or maybe light itself." Sarah pulled her improvised blanket tighter. "Will it come back?" "Probably." Marcus settled against the western wall, keeping watch through a small viewing gap. "But not tonight. Dawn's only a few hours away." He didn't mention that dawn might not matter if the water kept rising, or that his grandfather's stories suggested these creatures grew bolder as the flood deepened. Some knowledge was too heavy to share until absolutely necessary. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the dark water, ancient things waited for their next opportunity. The ancient waterproofing held, but Marcus knew it wouldn't last forever. Water seeped through hairline cracks in the pine pitch coating, each drop a countdown to catastrophe. The makeshift shelter groaned against the rising flood, and somewhere in the churning darkness beyond their walls, something massive moved beneath the surface. "How much higher can it go?" Sarah whispered, pressing her back against the sealed entrance they created using the old techniques his grandfather had taught him. The bare fat and charcoal mixture had hardened into an impermeable barrier, but the water pressure was building. Marcus checked his improvised water gauge, a notched stick he'd driven into the shelter floor. The flood had risen another 6 inches in the past hour. At this rate, they had maybe 3 hours before their refuge became their tomb. "We need to move higher," he said, though the words tasted like defeat. They'd already abandoned 2 previous positions, each time racing against the flood with their precious cargo of survivors. Now only 5 remained from the original hiking group of 12. Jake cradled his injured arm, the makeshift splint fashioned from stripped bark and sinew holding his shattered radius in place. "Where?" "The ridge is completely cut off. That thing in the water." He shuddered, remembering their last glimpse of it. Something serpentine and impossibly large, stirring the flood into whirlpools as it hunted. Through the sealed walls, they heard it again. The sound that had haunted them for hours, a rhythmic displacement of water, like breathing, but magnified beyond any natural scale. It was methodical, searching, intelligent. "The old mine shaft," Marcus said suddenly. "My grandfather mentioned caves that honeycomb this entire mountainside. Some of them connect to the mine works from the 1800s. If we can reach the entrance—" "That's a quarter-mile through open water," Elena protested. The marine biologist had been their voice of reason throughout this nightmare, but even her scientific mind struggled with what they'd witnessed. "And that thing is still out there." Marcus began gathering their supplies, the precious pine pitch that had kept them alive, the rendered bear fat that sealed their shelters, the charcoal mixture that made their barriers watertight. These ancient techniques, passed down through generations of mountain dwellers, were all that stood between them and the flood. "We build a float," he said, his hands already working the materials. "My people used to make emergency rafts using these same methods. Waterproof hides stretched over a wooden frame sealed with pitch and fat. The work was desperate and precise. Marcus heated the pitch mixture over their carefully maintained fire, the flames fed by resinous wood that burned hot despite the dampness. The others gathered deadfall and stripped bark according to his instructions, their movements urgent but controlled. As they worked, the thing in the water grew bolder. The shelter shook as something enormous brushed against its outer walls. Through the pitch-sealed gaps, they glimpsed a scaled hide that reflected their firelight like polished obsidian. The creature was testing their defenses, probing for weakness. "It knows we're here," David whispered. The teenager had aged years in the past day, his hiking enthusiasm replaced by hollow-eyed survival instinct. "It's been tracking us," Marcus confirmed, stretching waterproofed hide across the wooden frame. The ancient techniques required perfect execution, one weak seal, one untreated seam, and their raft would become a death trap. Ever since the dam broke and woke it up. The Clearwater Dam had been built over something that should have stayed buried. Marcus's grandfather had warned him about the deep places in these mountains, the things that slept in flooded caverns until the waters rose high enough to free them. The old man's stories weren't folklore, they were warnings. A thunderous impact shook their shelter. The creature had struck their wall directly, testing the ancient waterproofing's strength. Water sprayed through new cracks, and Marcus knew their time was up. "Raft's done," he announced, lifting the completed vessel. It looked impossibly fragile, hide and wood held together by techniques older than recorded history. But his grandfather's methods had kept people alive in these mountains for generations. They sealed their supplies in waterproof pouches made from treated animal bladders, each one coated with the precious pitch mixture. Everything depended on these ancient preservation techniques now, their food, their fire-starting materials, their medical supplies. The shelter wall buckled inward as something massive pressed against it from outside. Through the groaning wood, they heard a sound like escaping air, the creature's breathing, impossibly close. "Now," Marcus whispered. They breached their own wall in a controlled collapse, the ancient sealants giving way exactly as planned. Water rushed in, but they were already moving, lifting their raft into the flood as the thing in the darkness turned toward them with predatory hunger. The mine shaft lay ahead through churning black water, and behind them, something ancient and terrible began its pursuit. The real test of the old ways was just beginning. The waterproof shelter held against the relentless assault of wind and rain, but Marcus knew their sanctuary was temporary. Through the translucent pine resin coating the walls, he could see the water level rising steadily around their elevated platform. What concerned him more were the shadows moving beneath the surface, deliberate, coordinated movements that defied the chaotic current. "How long can we stay here?" Sarah whispered, clutching her injured arm. The makeshift splint fashioned from birch bark and sinew had held, but her face was pale with pain and exhaustion. Marcus checked his pocket watch, a habit from his military days that the wilderness hadn't broken. The storm's peak should pass in another hour. But the flooding— He trailed off, watching a massive pine tree sweep past their shelter like a toothpick. A low rumble echoed from somewhere beneath them, different from the thunder overhead. The platform shuddered, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd built the structure to withstand flooding, but he hadn't accounted for the creatures actively trying to bring it down. "Everyone stay calm," he said, though his own heart was hammering. "Tom, help me reinforce the corner supports. Lisa, keep pressure on that bandage." As Tom crawled toward the platform's edge, the water erupted 20 feet away. Something massive breached the surface, scales gleaming like black armor, eyes that reflected the lightning with an intelligence that made Marcus's blood freeze. It was easily 15 feet long, built like a crocodile but wrong in ways that made his mind rebel against cataloging the details. "Jesus Christ," Tom breathed, scrambling backward. The creature's gaze fixed on their shelter, and Marcus could swear he saw calculation in those ancient eyes. It disappeared beneath the surface with barely a ripple, leaving only the memory of its presence and the certainty that it wasn't alone. "What the hell was that thing?" Lisa's voice cracked. Marcus had seen the cave paintings deeper in the valley, the ones the university archaeologists had dismissed as folklore, symbols warning of something that emerged when the waters rose, something that had driven his grandfather's people to higher ground generations ago. He'd thought they were metaphors for flash floods and natural disasters. "Old residents," he said grimly. "Older than us, anyway." The platform tilted as something struck it from below. Marcus grabbed his makeshift spear, a walking stick tipped with a steel hunting knife bound with waterproofed cord. The ancient techniques weren't just about surviving the elements, they were about surviving everything the wilderness could throw at you. Another impact. This one from the opposite side. They were being tested, probed for weaknesses. Marcus had seen pack hunters work before, but never with this level of strategic thinking. "The resin torches," he barked. "Light them all." Sarah fumbled with the fire kit, her hands shaking as she struck flint against steel. The pine resin caught immediately, flooding their shelter with acrid smoke and dancing light. The shadows beneath the water recoiled, and for a moment, Marcus dared to hope. Then the real assault began. 3 of them hit the platform simultaneously from different angles. The entire structure groaned and lifted, sending everyone sliding toward the walls. Marcus drove his spear downward through a gap in the flooring, feeling it connect with something solid. A shriek echoed across the flooded valley, fury and pain combined into a sound that belonged in nightmares. "The smoke!" Tom shouted over the din. "It's working!" Marcus saw it too. The creatures were avoiding the areas where the thick resin smoke hung heaviest. Fire had always been humanity's first defense against the dark, and apparently some truths transcended time and species. He grabbed handfuls of pine pitch from their supplies, molding it around pieces of deadwood. "Everyone take some. If they breach the platform, throw these into the water and light them." The attacks stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Marcus counted heartbeats in the relative silence, broken only by the storm and the sound of debris rushing past. Through the translucent walls, he could see shapes circling at a distance, waiting. "Why did they stop?" Lisa whispered. Marcus was wondering the same thing when he noticed the water level. It had dropped 6 inches in the last few minutes. The storm was moving on, and with it the flood that had awakened these ancient predators. But their relief was short-lived. As the water receded, it revealed something that made Marcus's tactical mind race through rapidly diminishing options. The shoreline was lined with more of the creatures, dozens of them, watching their shelter with patient, intelligent eyes. "They're waiting for the water to drop," he realized aloud. "When it gets shallow enough..." He didn't need to finish. When the flood receded far enough, the creatures would be able to reach them without the protection of deep water, but the humans would still be trapped on their platform. The storm was ending, but the real fight was just beginning. The emergency shelter, pitched on the narrow ridge, felt like a fortress against the chaos below, but Marcus knew better than to trust appearances. Through the translucent walls, he could see the dark water still rising, now less than 10 feet from their position. The ancient waterproofing held strong, but the real test was yet to come. Sarah pressed herself against the back wall, her injured ankle throbbing. "How long can we stay here?" "Until dawn," Marcus replied, checking his watch. 3 hours until first light. The storm should break by then, and the water will start receding. A metallic scraping sound echoed from below, like claws dragging across stone. Everyone froze. "Still down there," whispered Jake, the youngest of the hiking group. His face had gone pale despite the warmth inside the shelter. Marcus nodded grimly. The creature, whatever it was, had been tracking them for hours. Every time they thought they'd found safety, it appeared again, adapted to the rising waters in ways that defied logic. Its elongated form moved through the flood with unnatural grace, and those phosphorescent eyes suggested intelligence that made Marcus's skin crawl. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," he said quietly, pulling out his grandfather's journal. The leather binding was worn smooth from decades of use, filled with observations about the mountain's hidden dangers. "My grandfather wrote about something like this, called it a valley guardian." "Guardian?" Tom scoffed. The group's de facto leader had grown increasingly skeptical of Marcus's methods. That thing tried to tear David apart. Marcus flipped through water-stained pages until he found the entry. According to this, it only attacks when the valley is threatened. The old-timers believed it protected the watershed from contamination. "We're not contaminating anything," Sarah protested. "But we are changing the ecosystem," Marcus said, pointing to their electric gear, water purification tablets, and synthetic materials. "Modern humans bring chemicals, electromagnetic signatures. Maybe it sees us as pollutants." Another scraping sound, closer now. The creature was climbing. Marcus moved to the shelter's entrance, where the ancient tar and pine resin created an airtight seal. The waterproofing techniques had worked perfectly, too perfectly. They'd created an environment completely isolated from the natural valley atmosphere. "That's it," he breathed. "We're sealed off from the ecosystem. It can't read us." "What are you talking about?" Tom demanded. "The waterproofing. It's not just keeping water out. It's masking our scent, our electromagnetic output, everything that would identify us as part of the natural order." Marcus began loosening one of the seal points. "If we crack it just slightly, let some of the valley air in." "Are you insane?" Tom grabbed his wrist. "You'll flood us." "Trust me." Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades reading the mountain's moods. "The creature isn't evil. It's confused. We need to show it we belong here." The shelter shuddered as something large pressed against the outer wall. Through the translucent membrane, they could see a shadow moving with deliberate purpose. Those glowing eyes appeared at the entrance, studying the sealed opening. Marcus carefully loosened the waterproof binding, allowing a thin stream of valley air to enter. The change was immediate. The acrid smell of floodwater mixed with pine and earth, but also something else, something wild and ancient. The creature's eyes brightened, and its massive head tilted as if listening to a frequency only it could hear. "It's working," Sarah whispered. But Tom had reached his breaking point. "This is madness." He lunged for the entrance, trying to reseal it completely. In the struggle, his boot caught the main support pole. The shelter collapsed partially, waterproof barriers tearing. Floodwater rushed in, and suddenly they were waist-deep in the freezing torrent. The creature reared back, confused by the sudden chaos. Marcus fought to maintain his footing as the current tried to sweep him away. "Everyone hold on to something!" The creature's confusion turned to aggression as chemicals from Tom's water purification kit leaked into the surrounding water. Its roar echoed across the flooded valley, a sound like grinding stone and rushing wind. "The journal!" Sarah called out, seeing the precious book floating away. Marcus dove for it, his fingers closing around the leather binding just as the creature's massive form surged toward them. But instead of attacking, it grabbed Marcus's jacket in its jaws and lifted him clear of the most dangerous current. For a moment, their eyes met, human and something far older. Marcus saw recognition there, and perhaps approval. Then the creature released him onto a more stable section of the ridge and disappeared back into the dark water. The remaining shelter material had wrapped around a cluster of rocks, creating a smaller but secure space. As they huddled together in the makeshift refuge, Marcus opened the journal to a page he'd never noticed before. "Listen to this," he said, squinting at his grandfather's faded handwriting. "The valley remembers those who respect its ways. In the greatest floods, the guardian becomes the protector." Dawn was still hours away, but somehow Marcus felt they would survive to see it. The ancient stone chamber shuddered as Marcus sealed the final breach with pine pitch and ash, his hands moving with desperate precision. Water crashed against the reinforced walls, but the waterproofing held, for now. Behind him, the survivors huddled together, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight. "How long can this place hold?" Sarah whispered, clutching her injured arm. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He pressed his ear to the wall, listening to the water's rhythm. The flood had reached its peak hours ago, but something else moved in those depths, something that had followed them up from the drowned valley below. "The water's starting to recede," he said finally. "But we're not safe yet." A low, resonant call echoed through the chamber walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The sound raised goosebumps along Marcus's arms. He'd heard it before, 16 years ago, when the last great flood had claimed his family. David, the youngest hiker, pointed toward the sealed entrance. What was that? Marcus checked his remaining supplies. Pine pitch nearly gone, only a handful of ash left. The traditional waterproofing techniques passed down through generations had saved them so far, but they'd need more than ancient wisdom to survive what came next. "Listen to me carefully," Marcus said, turning to face them all. "In a few minutes that call will sound again, closer this time. When it does, we move as one unit toward the back passage. No running, no panic. These creatures hunt by vibration." "Creatures," Tom's voice cracked. "You said there was only one. I was wrong." Marcus shouldered his pack, checking that his knife was secure. The flood woke the whole colony. They'd been sleeping in the deep caves for decades, waiting. Another call answered the first, this one from the opposite direction. Then another. The survivors exchanged terrified glances as the chamber filled with an underwater symphony of hunting cries. Marcus led them toward a narrow passage he'd discovered during their desperate flight, a crack in the rock that angled upward toward what he hoped was higher ground. The traditional knowledge of his ancestors had guided him here, memories of flood stories and safe havens passed down through oral tradition. "The old ones knew about this place," he explained as they squeezed through the passage. "They built these chambers as refuges, waterproofed them with techniques that lasted centuries. But they also knew what lived in the deep water." Sarah stumbled, her injured arm scraping against stone. The sound echoed loudly in the confined space. Everyone froze. Silence stretched for long seconds. Then came the sound of massive bodies moving through water, drawing closer to their hidden passage. Marcus motioned for absolute quiet and continued forward. The passage widened into another chamber, this one with ancient symbols carved into the walls, warnings, he realized, pictographs showing floods and creatures with too many teeth. "My God," whispered Elena, the archaeology student. "These drawings, they're recording flood cycles going back thousands of years." Marcus studied the symbols, his grandfather's teaching suddenly clicking into place. Every great flood brings them up from the depths. The survivors who made these carvings, they knew the pattern. A splash echoed from the passage behind them. Something had found their trail. There, Marcus pointed to a series of handholds carved into the far wall. The way out. They wouldn't have carved a refuge without an escape route. The climb was treacherous, made worse by the echo of pursuit below. Marcus helped each survivor reach the narrow tunnel above, their breathing harsh in the confined space. Behind them, something large scraped against stone, testing the width of the opening. They emerged onto a rocky ledge just as dawn broke over the mountain valley. Below them, the floodwaters stretched like a vast lake, but the level had dropped noticeably. In the distance, Marcus could see the tops of trees that had been submerged just hours before. "Look," David pointed toward the water's edge, far below. "Something's moving down there." Dark shapes circled in the depths, occasionally breaking the surface before disappearing again. The creatures that had hunted them through the flooded caves were real, ancient survivors of a world most people never knew existed. Marcus pulled out his emergency radio, finally getting a signal from their elevated position. "This is Marcus Webb calling rescue services. I have 5 survivors at coordinates." He rattled off their position, then added, "We need immediate extraction. Do not send divers or water rescue teams. I repeat, do not enter the floodwaters." As they waited for rescue, Marcus looked back at the hidden entrance to the ancient refuge. His ancestors' knowledge had saved them, waterproofing techniques, flood patterns, and warnings about what lived in the deep places. The helicopter appeared an hour later, its rotors beating against the morning sky. As they lifted away from the mountain, Marcus watched the floodwaters continue their retreat, taking their ancient predators back to the depths where they belonged. Below them, the valley began to emerge from its watery shroud, forever changed but finally safe.